What a great pleasure it is to once again participate and celebrate the marvelous museum that's done so much to teach the American people about the stakes at risk in World War II and to honor the heroes and heroines on the fields of battle and on the home front who won that all-important conflict. It is so appropriate that the person we have here to celebrate with us is Madeleine Albright, a woman whose remarkable service to our country was shaped by that war and the Cold War which followed from it. Twice her family was forced to flee from the terrors of totalitarianism. First the Nazis, then the communists. Those experiences made Madeleine a profound lover of freedom. Becoming a U.S. citizen when she was at Wellesley College showed her commitment to this country at an age when most young women were thinking about, what else? Boys and clothes. I should know. My daughter Cokie was at Wellesley just a couple of years later. Well, maybe Cokie thought about politics too. Madeleine brought that devotion to her chosen country and passion for freedom to her job as the first female Secretary of State, where she crusaded for human rights and for the continuation of the march of democracy across Europe, the continent so many had given their lives for in World War II. While she was on that quest, she visited that other campaigner for human rights, Pope John Paul II. I had the honor of being the ambassador to the Holy See at the time. Think of it, a female Secretary of State and a female ambassador at the Vatican. It certainly showed that what the United States is all about. It was also a lot of fun. Always wanting to do the right thing, Madeleine contacted me to ask what the proper attire would be for a private papal audience. I told her she needed to cover her head, elbows, and knees. Imagine my amusement and delight when I arrived at the airport and watched hatbox after hatbox unloaded from the official airplane of the Secretary of State. Madeleine and I had such a good time together. Talk about diplomacy, a couple of women who spent so much of our lives negotiating with the Old Boys Network. The country never had it so good. It is a great joy to introduce my friend and my secretary, Madeleine Albright.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm the one that needs the little box here, so hope not to fall off. It is a pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you, Ambassador Boggs, for your very kind words and for your service to New Orleans and to our nation. I think Lindy has really been a legend for all of us, and Louisiana gave the world jazz, for which we're all grateful, but it also gave us Lindy Boggs. Madam Ambassador, if Napoleon had only known that he would be depriving France of you, the Louisiana Purchase would never have been made. And we're very proud as Americans to claim Lindy Boggs. And And it was kind of surprising to go to the Vatican together, and it was really wonderful to be there with you and to have you be our remarkable ambassador there. I'm very honored also to have a chance to address this landmark international conference. I want to thank the D-Day Museum and all who've been involved in organizing this event. Nick Miller, thank you. I so enjoyed what I heard this afternoon, and Governor Pete Wilson, it's a great honor that you are doing this, so thank you so much. We may be a year late, but that just goes to show that no matter how powerful we might think we are, there are other forces that are still more powerful. Over the past few days, this conference has heard from a brilliant array of speakers who've covered every aspect of the Second World War. And last night you had the pleasure of listening to James Bradley and the extraordinary story of the flags of our fathers. My role was somewhat different because the original flag of my father, although it also was red, white, and blue, represented the young and fragile country of Czechoslovakia. When I was still an infant, Hitler invaded, and my parents escaped to England, where we spent World War II. And the thing that really distinguishes me from all other Americans my age is that I actually lived through bombing in London as a child. My father was the part of the government in exile, which broadcast information back to Czechoslovakia through BBC, and sharing the truth and trying to keep hope alive among an occupied people. Among my first memories are those of huddling in bomb shelters and singing songs like 100 Green Bottles Are Hanging on the Wall with my British neighbors and waiting for the all clear sound, and then coming home to blackouts and playing around a table which people said would help us survive if the house we were in was bombed, and then watching my father come in late at night after being an air raid warden. My favorite food was a mixture of leftover potatoes and cabbage all fried up. It was called Bubble and Squeak, which is what happened to our stomachs after we ate it. I was 8 when the war ended, and we returned to Prague. My father went with the government, and we came back to Czechoslovakia in a bomber, and it took me a while to ever want to get back on a plane again. And I came back with my very British accent and tried to figure out how to be a good little Czechoslovak girl. In a way, we were very lucky because Prague, unlike many European cities, had not been bombed except for one bomb that had been dropped by accident by the Allies. And so I was very confused when I got back to Prague because I knew that the Allies were on our side, and yet the only damage had actually been done by accident by this American bomb. In another way, though, we were the furthest thing from lucky. Much of Czechoslovakia's Jewish population had been destroyed, including 3 of my grandparents, though it was many years before I learned the full truth of how and why they died. For a time, my parents and their friends hoped that Czechoslovakia would return to the liberal democratic tradition it had created prior to the war. It, as you mentioned, Professor, earlier today, it was modeled on the United States. The Czechoslovak Constitution is a copy of the American one, except that it does have equal rights terms in it. But the return to democracy was not to be. An agreement made during World War II allowed the Red Army to liberate Czechoslovakia. Americans stopped 45 miles short of Prague, and so fate was changed. The Soviet Union didn't invade, at least not at that time, but ultimately they were able to subvert the country. Many Czechs and Slovaks identified with Mother Russia as a nation of fellow Slavs. The West, after all, was associated with the Munich Pact, which had given Hitler a green light to claim parts of Czechoslovakia for himself. And the local Communist Party had a following because it posed as a protector of the working class and because party members got to call each other comrade, which apparently they enjoyed. As a result, the Communists became the largest political party and even won a plurality in the 1946 elections. This led to a coalition government in which a man by the name of Jan Masaryk became foreign minister. Masaryk was the son of the founder and first president of Czechoslovakia, who was married to an American. And interestingly enough, even though he married at the end of the 19th century, he took his wife's maiden name as his middle name. Her name was Charlotte Gehrig, and he was always known as Thomas Gehrig Masaryk. In Europe, Jan Masaryk was famous, but when he came to the United States, there was some confusion. An American senator asked him how his father was doing and whether he still played the violin. Jan replied, "Sir, I fear that you are making a small mistake. You are perhaps thinking of Paderewski and not Masaryk. Paderewski, who was the president of Poland, plays the piano, not the violin, and was president not of Czechoslovakia, but of Poland. Of our presidents, Beneš was the only one who played, but he played neither the violin nor the piano, but football. In all other respects, your information is totally correct." As a foreign minister, Jan Masaryk was my father's boss. He was his chief of staff. And the two of them were among those who spoke up for democracy as the communists began to use bullying tactics to increase their power and salami tactics to systematically capture Eastern Europe. When President Truman announced the Marshall Plan and invited the countries of Central and Eastern Europe to join, the Czechoslovaks thought they would accept. But the Soviet leaders summoned Masaryk to Moscow and told him that Czechoslovakia could not participate. When he returned to Prague, Masaryk confessed to his colleagues, "I am no longer the foreign minister of a sovereign country." The following year, in March 1948, his body was found outside the window of his office. The communists said it was suicide. Every Czechoslovak Democrat knew that it was murder. Masaryk's death created a moment of truth for Western leaders who then understood that the communists would be relentless in pushing for power and that this aggression must be contained and opposed. His sacrifice, more than any other event, triggered the creation of the North Atlantic Alliance, or NATO, and thus began a new chapter in the life of the Euro-Atlantic community and, frankly, of my own. Because of the communist takeover, my family was once again forced to leave home, and this time we came to America. My father got a job at the University of Denver, and we bought a little Ford green coupe and drove across America. He knew that Denver was known as the Mile High City, but we never went up. And so all of a sudden he said, "I think we're going the wrong direction." But we did end up in Denver, and my mother used to say there are two great cities in the world, Prague and Denver. Of course, she'd never been to New Orleans. My father wrote books about the importance of freedom and taught students, including his favorite, a young woman of whom you might have heard, Condoleezza Rice. I pursued my own education about change in communist societies and my interest in politics, and I later served in the Carter White House, working for another naturalized American, Zbigniew Brzezinski. When Reagan came in and Carter went out, I decided to do a research project on the status of the media behind the Iron Curtain, specifically on Poland. And it was there that I had the opportunity the first time to hear a speaker by the name of Lech Walesa. He was an electrician with long hair and a dark flowing mustache and a powerful and fearless manner of speaking. From him and from the dissident journalists I interviewed, I began to think perhaps that the Cold War would not go on forever. Perhaps we would not have to accept the permanent division of Europe or the endless reality of barbed wire and gulags. Perhaps the flame of freedom had not entirely gone out. There had, of course, been signs of resistance before. In 1948, Yugoslavia's Tito broke with Stalin. In 1953, there were riots in East Germany. In 1956, first the Poles and then the Hungarians tried to rebel. And in 1968, it was Czechoslovakia's turn, a period of reform called the Prague Spring that raised hopes only to be crushed by the Soviet tanks. But it was not until the Polish Solidarity movement that the cracks in the foundation of the Soviet Empire truly started to show, and it turned out that religion was communism's Achilles heel. In 1979, Pope John Paul II returned for the first time as Pope to his native land. Formerly the Bishop of Kraków, the Pope exemplified the central role that religion played in Polish history and life. The authorities made a tactical mistake by allowing church officials to organize the visit, giving them a chance to arrange direct contacts between the people's Pope and the Pope's people. In his homilies, the pontiff urged his audience not to be afraid, a simple message with enormous impact. And slowly at first, but with gathering momentum, the Pope's listeners drew strength. Their sense of isolation and helplessness began to slip away. And the phrase I use to describe this is not grammatical, but it fits. Standing amid huge crowds, the freedom-loving people of Poland suddenly realized how many of each other there were. As that happened, the Berlin Wall began to tremble, but it was not yet ready to fall. For example, over in Czechoslovakia, it did not appear that much was going on. But the seeds of resistance were in fact being sown, and the unlikely inspiration was a different sort of religion, good old American rock and roll and jazz. The Plastic People of the Universe, a group named for a Frank Zappa song, became so popular that authorities grew nervous and stopped them from giving concerts. More than 250 intellectuals and artists protested, signing a document called Charter 77, demanding that the government respect the right of free expression. I wanted to see for myself what was going on, and so I visited Czechoslovakia twice in the mid-1980s. And as soon as I arrived the first time, I arranged to meet with a group of dissidents at the apartment of a friend. I also happened to bump into a United States senator who told me that he too wanted to meet with some of the dissidents. Now, this particular senator was not the brightest bulb under the Capitol dome, and he had no experience dealing with a totalitarian state. Sharing a car earlier in the day, the senator had asked, "Will there really be dissidents at the meeting?" And since I kept going like this, making clear that the car was bugged, I could not keep him silent. "Which dissidents will be there?" I signaled again. "Why don't you tell me about the dissidents?" I put my hand over my mouth, shook my head, and pointed all over the car at imaginary bugs. "Well, fine. If you don't want to talk about the dissidents, don't." That evening, we were told the people who were supposed to see could not come because they had been picked up, and so the senator stayed away. But one leader of Charter 77 did show up anyway because he hadn't yet gone home to the place where the police was waiting for him. And the two of us almost talked for 4 hours. And about midway, I received a phone call from the senator. "Hello, Madeline," he said over the open line. "I heard some dissidents did show up. Are they still there?" I said quickly, "You must have the wrong number," and hung up. A little later, there was a knock on the door, and it was the senator. He strode right over to my companion and poked him repeatedly in the chest and said, "Are you really a dissident? Are you sure you're a dissident?" I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The next year, I returned to Czechoslovakia and a little taste of Cold War cloak and dagger myself. I was told to wait for a man in a raincoat at a precise time in front of a certain building near a church on a well-known square with a monument. I showed up and tried to act casual. In fact, I never felt so nervous. Suddenly, a man in a raincoat did appear. "Follow me," he said in Czech. "We're going to a metro stop several minutes away. Don't ask me where." When we got on the train, he said, "Get really close to me. We'll pretend we're lovers and no one will notice." I then received a nice kiss on the lips from a man I'd never seen before to a destination I had no idea where. We arrived and walked a few blocks to a dull, block-like building and headed down into the basement. There on the shelves were my host's prized possessions, copies of the Rolling Stones magazine. His name was Karel Srp, and he was head of the jazz section, a group that had formed to play music but later ventured into politics. We talked for hours about the dangers dissidents faced, the strategies they used, and the dreams that they had. And each of these visits behind the Iron Curtain reminded me how lucky I was to be able to get on a plane after a few days and return home to America to freedom. If not for the choices my family was able to make, I would have grown up under the communists. And I always ask myself, but never know, whether I would have had the courage to become a dissident, to risk jail and even death. When the end of the Cold War came, it was the astonishing suddenness, like a cliff worn away by erosion suddenly breaking off and falling into the sea. After 10 eventful years, the Solidarity movement finally brought a democratic government to Poland and blazed a trail that others would quickly follow. In Hungary, freedom emerged after a showdown lasting only 10 months. In Germany, 10 weeks. In Czechoslovakia, 10 days. And in Romania, roughly 10 hours. By 1990, the line that had been drawn across Europe 4 decades earlier was no more. In Berlin, they danced on the wall. In Prague's Wenceslas Square, a few days later, we sang the old civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." In Warsaw, the election posters for Solidarity showed a picture of Gary Cooper in the movie High Noon. Communism and freedom had faced each other in the streets, and freedom had won. I have to say that last night was actually the anniversary of the Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution, November 17th, and I did something amazing. I was with Václav Havel, who is now in New York temporarily at Columbia, and for his 70th birthday, they are performing all his plays in New York. And so we went to one of his plays, and it was remarkable. And then we all sang, "We Shall Overcome," and then one of the people who was playing said, "What is the right way to celebrate the Velvet Revolution? What is it that they said?" And so I said what they said in Czech, which is Havel na hrad, which means Havel to the castle, and that's how Havel became president of the Czechoslovakia, and it was just wonderful yesterday to celebrate that. During the 80s, I was teaching courses in East European politics and on US-Soviet relations. And I look at my library now, and it looks as though I had been an archaeologist. Needless to say, I had to throw away all my notes and start afresh, and I was really delighted to do so. It seemed the world had truly turned right side up. The Cold War was over, and some were saying that the West had won a permanent victory. Some even said we had reached the end of history. Exhilarated as I was, I still surprised my students by predicting that the new world might be even more perilous than the old, but that's another story, beyond the scope of this conference. In order to make sense of history, we have no choice but to divide it into bite-sized chunks, even though we know that it is really a continuous stream. The Cold War was an outgrowth of World War II, which grew out of World War I, which grew out of the failure of leaders at the time to imagine what a continental war would really be like. And after each crisis, the victors get together and come up with ideas for preventing similar disasters. And those ideas might be in the form of principles, for example, opposition to appeasement and support for military preparedness. Or they might create the basis for institutions such as NATO or the United Nations. We struggle as best we can to learn from the past in order to safeguard the future. This struggle can make a difference. The Cold War, for all its brutality, did not lead to the nightmare of nuclear Armageddon. But we must accept the reality that neither World War II nor the Cold War nor any conflicts before or since has resulted in a final victory. Evil will always be among us because it is always in some measure within us. As Dean Acheson observed, good and evil can and do exist concurrently in the whole realm of human life. They exist within every individual, within every nation, and within every human group. Our challenge and our fate is always to do battle, to call upon what Abraham Lincoln referred to as the better angels of our nature, to support and help one another so that together we might resist the dangers we will forever face. Over the years, the enemy's mask may change from Nazi to communist to racist to apostle of terror, but always the twisted logic is the same. Always we hear the claim that the human race is divided between them and us, and that their security requires our destruction. There is, they insist, but one truth, a truth demanding a holy war for the glory of the fatherland, the purity of blood, the supremacy of race, the power of class, or the satisfaction of a vengeful God. To use an old New Orleans expression that begins with B, balderdash. In democracy, we do not claim title to the truth because the only truths we hold self-evident are those that allow individuals to determine for themselves whose philosophy they will adopt, which leaders they will select, and what kind of life they will pursue. Since D-Day, more than 60 years have passed. 3 full generations have been born and come of age. Throughout that time, we have seen the veterans of World War II at picnics and parades, saluting with medals and ribbons on their chests, seeing the pride in their bearing and thinking perhaps, what a fine thing it must have been to be tested in a great cause and to have prevailed. But as this museum reminds us, behind each medal and ribbon there's a story of heroism, yes, but also profound sadness. For World War II reflected not only the height of human spirit, but also the depths. Today we stand on the shoulders of those who were forced to fight from North Africa to Salerno, from Normandy to Bulge to Berlin, taking back an entire continent, village by village, hill by hill. And further eastward, from Tarawa to Okinawa, the death struggle for Asia was an assault against dug-in positions surmounted only by unbelievable courage and unbearable loss. We stand on the shoulders, too, of those who struggled to sustain freedom's course through the dark days of the Cold War, those once labeled as dissidents and refuseniks and traitors and enemies of the people, the desperate killed trying to escape, the suicides with hands tied behind their backs, the torture-scarred, the informed upon, the uprisers. Let us never forget that we are the recipients of a precious gift from those whose consciences could not accept the theft of liberty or the reality of aggression and genocide. Today, our shared challenge is to honor the legacy by making certain that the rule of law prevails and democracy succeeds. If we are to be true to heroes past, we must never forget why World War II and the Cold War were fought and how they were won. And we must uphold democratic principles to our own societies, understanding that we cannot defeat our enemies by descending to their level. We must maintain solidarity with one another, never allowing petty differences to interfere with the most profound values we share. We must dedicate ourselves to the principle that every individual counts. And with Lincoln, we must commit our lives to our sacred honor to the proposition the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You got your question? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think, thank you. I think we're now going to have some questions and answers, and the best part about no longer being Secretary of State is I can actually answer your questions. So are there mics going around? Bill?
We have some mics.
Yeah.
We have microphones. Microphones coming.
Just stand up and ask if
You're going to do.
and we'll repeat the question.
Madam Secretary, I'm from New Orleans.
And all this has been great, and I appreciate you being here. I'd like to know what you think about Katrina.
I'd be happy to answer that. What do I think about Katrina? I have to say that I was down here last spring for the first time. I had been asked to come and speak at Tulane because the students at Tulane had missed a semester and they were trying to make up some of the time. I obviously, along with all Americans, had watched the destruction of New Orleans, and I had watched a lot of the news afterwards. But I was then taken on a tour of New Orleans by a woman who's now the architect for Tulane, but had been a city planner here before. And so I got the most incredible tour that anybody could get, and I was stunned because a year later, going through the Ninth Ward and various other places, I was shocked by the fact that, as somebody who lived in Washington, D.C. and watched CNN and occasionally Fox, that I had only seen a very small amount of this, and that how much of New Orleans had been destroyed. I also stayed somewhere downtown in a fancy hotel, and I thought, this is not real, to have certain parts of the city functioning and the rest of it desolate. And the thing I have to say, and I said this earlier in my remarks, I was in London during the Blitz, so I've seen what a destroyed city looks like, and New Orleans was a tragedy. So I felt very strongly that we as Americans, all of us, should have paid much more attention to what was going on here. I think it's very hard for Americans to say, let's spend our money on some country we never heard of, instead of spending it on what is happening in New Orleans. But I would also say that this is a country that is so rich, if it wants to be, that we can do both. And I have to say, I was stuck in a traffic jam. I've never been so happy to be in a traffic jam because it shows that New Orleans is coming back.
Someone from New Orleans, I appreciate that. Madam Secretary, could you tell me a little bit about how you found out that you had a Jewish heritage, and what kind of an impact has that made on your perspective in life and your thinking?
Well, how did I find out about my Jewish heritage, and what kind of an impact has it had? Well, as I mentioned, we lived in England during the war, came home, and I knew that I was told my grandparents had died during the war. And now that I'm a grandparent myself, I regret ever thinking this. Grandparents are old, they die. And I had not particularly thought about how this might have happened. We came to the United States, and I was raised a Catholic. And I basically had a very complicated story anyway, some of which I've told tonight. And I had parents who told me that they had been raised in Czechoslovakia, that they were Catholic, that this was our background. And I really didn't, for the most part, if you don't know something, you don't question something. So it never occurred to me there was any kind of a different story. There were times when I was at the United Nations, I started getting letters from all kinds of people about all kinds of things, mostly saying they were my relatives and send money, please, or get them a visa or something. And I would get letters from people saying that they had known my parents, and then they'd give a bunch of facts that didn't make any sense, that my father, they'd known him in high school in 1916 when he would have been 6 years old, and the facts never matched. I did get one letter from somebody that was a Serb, and the Serbs didn't like me very much because of what I was doing or advocating in Bosnia, and that person called me a Jewish bitch, and I decided to ignore that. But in the fall of 1996, I got a letter from somebody where all of a sudden all the facts started to line up. They had the names of my mother and the village she came from and the dates and the years, etc. And they said that both my parents came from fine Jewish families. And it was about the time that I was being, they called me into the White House to say that my name was on a short list for Secretary of State, and they began to vet me. And one of the lawyers at the White House said, "Is there anything about you that we don't know that we should know?" And I said, "Well, I think it's possible that I'm of Jewish background." And they said, "Well, so what? Our president isn't anti-Semitic." So that was that. And over the holidays, I had a discussion with my children about this. And they said, "Oh my goodness, certainly our background is very complicated. Isn't this interesting?" My youngest daughter is married to a Jewish man, so that set of in-laws was very happy. And then what happened was a reporter for the Washington Post, what happens is when you have just been nominated but haven't been confirmed, you're not allowed to talk to reporters. But he had said that he was going to do a profile of me, and so I gave him names of everybody I could think of. I don't have a lot of family left. And all of a sudden, the day I was confirmed, I came back to my office and he started accusing me of lying, and it was a very bad time. And I hadn't lied, but it was not very pleasant. And so I had a real mixture of feelings. Here I had been named to a post that a woman had never held. And then we went into the State of the Union. No woman had ever led the cabinet down the center aisle of the House. And all I could think about was, I'm going to lose this job because they think I lied. So it was a very difficult time, but President Clinton and Vice President Gore were obviously understanding, and I hadn't lied. So it did not, but to the question of how it impacted my policy, it didn't. Because I had been raised, I knew what the Holocaust was about, I just didn't know it applied to me personally. I knew the difference between good and evil, and I knew that, and I believed very much in the goodness of American power. And the whole theme of my memoirs is about that it makes a difference when the U.S. is engaged. Because when the U.S. was not at Munich, terrible things happened. When the U.S. came into World War II, everything was changed. And when the U.S. didn't liberate Czechoslovakia, that also changed everything. And so it didn't impact me really beyond a very personal way, which it obviously did, but not in terms of my policy views, because I had been raised right.
Secretary Albright, can you give us some suggestions to deal with our lack of teaching history in the schools in the United States? Our children absolutely, they can go on the internet, they can play games, but they have no idea of the world and its history. And do you have any suggestions or thoughts on how we might correct this?
How to teach history to our children. I have to say, I so love history, and it's so interesting to me. My father really was a great teacher, and he had wonderful stories, and history is obviously a collection of stories. But the main problem is how you create the curricula in the schools, and to have people understand that you can't know anything about the present and can't do anything about the future if you don't understand history. So I think that, I watch this in my own, well, my children are pretty good, but my grandchildren, in terms of there has to, without going into how we all raise children, I think that the kids these days are so addicted to action and fast-paced things that history is a little slow for them. I think it has to be a major part of the curriculum. But the other thing that has to be a part of it is teaching geography, and those two go together. And I have said over and over again, I used to go, when I was secretary, I would travel around. We actually had a website, Travels with the Secretary. And if you go into most American classrooms, there's a flat map on the wall, which has the Western Hemisphere in the middle, and then has little flaps on the side that indicate there may be something there. And so I usually ask for a globe, and then I turn it around for the kids, and I say, most of the people in the world live on the other side of the globe. But I think it has to be, parents should demand that, although many parents don't know anything about history either, but so grandparents should demand that history be taught because it's essential. But the hard part is there's a lot more history since I studied it. And I think that when, we used to take courses in 20th century history that didn't seem so difficult. And it's a matter of there's a lot to cover. And the question is how to make it exciting. I think our students, unfortunately, need to be titillated all the time. So,
Well, yeah. I don't think you can have correct foreign policy unless the people understand nations and history and geography.
I agree. Some of our leaders might figure that out. Yeah, yes, yeah, yes.
Madam Secretary, kind of along a similar theme of figuring some things out. We've talked certainly over the last few days about the war and how the war changed America and America's role in the world. Of course, our role in the world is continuing to change. I'm curious on your thoughts as to the nation's role today and the nation's role in the future and how we get there from here, wherever there may be.
Well, to go back to a point I made earlier, I so believe in the importance of America and the role that we have to play. And I know that it gets controversial at various times, the extent to which the United States needs to be involved internationally. And my whole life has been based on American engagement, and I won't go through that again, but I really do think that it's essential. I do think we are an exceptional nation. In the way that we have, I can't tell you what it's, well, maybe some of you have had the same experience, but as a naturalized American who came here seeking I was 11, but with my parents seeking freedom, and then having my father, who had actually defected, be able to come to the United States and get a job and then end up as a dean of a graduate school and then having me end up as Secretary of State. So it's an amazing story, and it's only due to the generosity of the American people and to the veterans in this room. So I am a little sentimental about this whole issue. I am very troubled by America's current role. It's not, this sounds strange, it's not easy to be America when you're sitting there with a sign that says United States and trying to figure out how to do the job. Because sometimes if you're the United States, you're damned if you do or damned if you don't. If we get involved somewhere, then they tell us we shouldn't be in there. If we don't do something, they get mad at us. Rwanda, for instance. So it's hard either way. I did, as I said, I used to talk about the United States, President Clinton said it first, but everybody attributes it to me, that we are the indispensable nation. And I said it for many reasons, but one was also to motivate the American people, because I was saying it after the end of the Cold War, when I think a lot of Americans finally thought, okay, we did World War II, we've now done the Cold War, okay, enough. We don't want to do this anymore. But I felt that the world could not exist without American participation. I went to enough meetings to know that if the U.S. didn't put forward an idea or support an idea or occasionally let somebody else have our idea, then nothing happened. There were those who didn't like it, and in fact the French called us a hyperpower. It sounds better in French than it does in English, and I was hyper-Madeline. But I did see us as an indispensable nation. But indispensable doesn't mean alone, and it doesn't mean ubiquitous. It is in partnership, and whatever. When I was at the UN, and then as secretary, I sometimes talked about us as a first partner or a managing partner or different ways. But there was the adjective might change, but the emphasis was on the partner, and so I see that. I think, whether you read the New Testament or Spider-Man, I believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. And therefore, the United States, I think, has this role. And I do think we're exceptional, but I don't think exceptions can be made for us. And when we are in a war where we are now torturing people, then we have lost our moral authority. And that is what troubles me the most. So I don't feel this way about World War II, but this war that we're involved in now is a war of choice, not of necessity. And I have written in my new book, which by the way is called The Mighty and the Almighty, and it's on sale. And I have written that I am afraid that Iraq is going to go down in history as the greatest disaster in American foreign policy. I am very troubled by it, and we have to end. Yes. One more, last, yeah.
Given the situation as it is, how would you resolve it, Madam Secretary?
Let me say this. Let me go back and explain a little bit my context for Iraq. I understand the why of this war. I said all the same things about Saddam Hussein that President Bush has said, and I in fact said it for longer, because I said it for 8 years. I think Saddam Hussein was everything. He invaded another country, he gassed his own people, he tortured people, he stole property, everything that President Bush said. So I agree with the why. I even thought there were weapons of mass destruction, because the inspectors, when they left in 1998, had not accounted for all the weapons. I didn't understand, however, why now or why then the war had to happen. Because the people who hit us on 9/11 did not come from Iraq. They came from Afghanistan, and there was no connection between Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and Saddam Hussein. And so I did not think that whatever weapons were there posed any threat to the region or to the United States. There was not a delivery system. Were flying sorties all the time over the no-fly zones. We had sanctions. So we should have kept our eye on the ball on Afghanistan. And all you have to do is read about what's going on in Afghanistan now to know that that war is not over. And President Karzai is a very fine man, but he's basically mayor of Kabul by day. And the Taliban is resurging, and their bad relations with Pakistan, and so we took our eye off the ball by going into Iraq. And then, and I was listening to the panel this afternoon, I was called into the Pentagon. Some of us former people were called in there, and I asked, what next? They had no plan. They had no timetable. I know you disagree. Didn't you? No? Just for the Army. I had done enough post-conflict situations to know that when Doug Feith laid something out on this, it didn't work. So I understood the why. I didn't understand why now or what next. So here we are, 3.5 years later, and I have to say there are no good solutions. There are only least bad solutions. And I have been saying this was a war of choice, not of necessity, and getting it right is a necessity and not a choice. But I think that we have to be very careful about how we leave. I do think we have to leave because the American presence is both the solution but also the problem. So I have the following ideas, and they are this. And I've said this in Europe, and it's especially true to say this in front of this audience. I've been in Europe, and I said the United States did not start World War I or World War II, but when we saw that it affected our national interest, we went in there and we turned them around. The Europeans and others may not agree with how this war started, but it affects their national interests as much as it does ours, and they need to get in there and help. They need to help train the Iraqi security forces, and so that we don't have to be the only ones providing the security. It does mean that we have to give up some of the contracts so that they can do reconstruction there. And they need to have a buy-in into this to understand that this can't just be America's problem. We need to get regional buy-in. The United States has to decide that it has to talk to people we don't like. You make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. We need to talk to the Syrians and the Iranians, and we need to work on the Middle East peace process. So it's a huge agenda. Everybody in Washington is now salivating over the potential of the Baker-Hamilton study group report. They are talking to people. I hope that, and Congress is doing a lot of different things on this. I think that we have to have some kind of a benchmarked withdrawal plan. I personally am not somebody who believes in setting a date certain for withdrawal. We did that in Bosnia. We said we'd be out in a year. We weren't out, and so our credibility was questioned. So I think this war is a disaster, which means that it's worse than Vietnam, not in the number of Americans who've died or Iraqis and Vietnamese, but in terms of its unintended consequences in a region that is already destabilized and dangerous. This is a terrible way to end the evening. I want to thank you all. I am a great admirer of what this museum is doing. I'm thrilled that I was asked to be here. Thank you so much, and my honor to all of you. Thank you.